Recently, I've been listening to a podcast called Huberman Lab, which is an excellent podcast, and the podcast is all about neuroscience and principles from neuroscience which you can use to apply to your everyday life. This week's episode was all about smell, taste, and pheromones, all of which are related to perfumery. So I thought this week I would provide a summary of what I thought were the three most interesting pieces of knowledge which you can apply both to your perfumery and to your everyday life. Right, so the first thing that I found quite interesting were the mechanisms behind the different ways in which we can actually smell things and perceive them differently. So when you smell something, basically what happens is you have a molecule and that goes into your nose and then it hits something called a receptor. And once the molecule has docked into the receptor, it sends a signal through your neurons, and that signal is processed in the brain in order to create what you perceive as a smell. Now, the interesting thing is once this signal is inside your brain, it can actually be processed in different ways. So one way that it can be processed is what's called an innate olfactory response. This is basically when you have a deep-rooted reaction inside of you, due to being a human being, to that odour. So something like sewage, you'll instantly think smells disgusting. And even if you'd never smelt sewage before, say you'd smelt it for the first time when you were an adult, you would still have that instinct to think that it's horrible. On the other hand, you can have something called a learned olfactory response. This may be something that you start off in life not particularly having a strong opinion of, but depending on the context and the situation in which you smell it, you can learn to either love it or hate it. A good example of this is learning to love the smell of someone you're in a relationship with, or even just the smell of their clothes. Now, the reason that this is interesting in the context of perfumery is that some smells, so when you use some raw materials in your perfumes, those smells are going to be universally nice to almost everyone, unless they have a really strong learned response against it. But on the other hand, certain smells are going to be quite different depending on who it is smelling the perfume. So if you can get to know which smells everyone seems to like and which smells seem to be quite divisive, then you can use that knowledge in your perfume, for example, to make a range of perfumes that's balanced, try to make sure you've got something for everyone. In fact, I'm pretty sure that this is why, for the large international fragrance companies, they try to hire perfumers from a large variety of backgrounds rather than all hiring them from one place. So if you hire perfumers from a large variety of backgrounds, that means they've all got different sets of learned olfactory responses depending on their childhood, their upbringing, their culture. So this is helpful in two ways. Firstly, if you want to launch a perfume in a target market, say it's from Brazil, it would be good to have a perfumer who's from Brazil because they know which kind of learned olfactory responses are going to be good, more likely in that area, so you've got a higher chance of getting something that's going to fit the target market. The other thing is if you've got a lot of perfumers from a variety of backgrounds, it's much more likely you're going to be able to work out which things universally smell nice and therefore which things are safe to put in products, say, that are going to be sold internationally. But anyway, apart from learned and innate olfactory responses, there are still other factors that can affect the way people smell things. Another good example is genes. Some people literally have different genes in their DNA which alters the way they perceive smells in the first place. One good example of this is parsley, or cilantro in American English. This is a commonly used cooking herb which a lot of people like. However, to some people, one of my friends included, this tastes absolutely disgusting. My friend says any food with parsley in it to him just tastes like soap. Anyway, moving on. So the next fact that I found really interesting in the podcast was it turns out your olfactory neurons are actually really special in the sense that they're some of the only neurons in your brain which can actually replenish. So what happens is about every 20 to 30 days, your olfactory neurons actually die off and they get replaced by new, fresh neurons. And this is really unique because this doesn't happen to many other neurons in the brain at all. Most other neurons that you have, say for your memory, they just get repaired, but they don't actually get replaced. Now, if you're training to be a perfumer, this piece of knowledge is actually really valuable because what it means is that you can train your sense of smell to improve very quickly. Unlike your other senses, you can't just train those up to be better very easily, but with your sense of smell, you can. And what it was found that is if you sniff a lot and try to smell things often, you can actually signal to your brain that it needs more of these olfactory neurons. And because the olfactory neurons replenish so quickly, what it means is that these olfactory neurons can actually increase in number. So you can actually literally have a higher ability to smell things. You can actually develop a higher sensitivity in your nose very quickly. And all you need to do is be sniffing things and trying to smell things all the time. Actually, what you'll probably find is if you are training in perfumery, your sense of smell will rapidly increase if you're evaluating your raw materials quite often, because you're literally increasing the number of olfactory neurons in your brain to deal with the smells that you're smelling. Another thing that was actually mentioned in the podcast was this rate of replenishment can be improved if you're exercising regularly and if you've got a good level of dopamine. So if you don't know what dopamine is basically a neurotransmitter. It's something naturally found in your body, and it's associated with goal-seeking behavior or reward-driven behavior. So what that suggests to me is, say you're exercising every day and you're working kind of on tasks, or you're trying to learn things, working on challenges. So for example, developing a new perfume could be one of those. Then you're in a prime spot to be growing those new olfactory neurons. Okay, and then on to the final topic, which I really like, and that is that studies have shown that peppermint oil increases attention. What this means is you could make a perfume with peppermint oil, though you wouldn't have to make a perfume. You could just use peppermint oil on its own. And you could use this while you're training or studying or trying to learn something, and it will actually increase the alertness in your brain and allow you to focus and hold attention better. On the other hand, if you're trying to make a relaxing candle fragrance for just before bed or a relaxing bath oil, you probably want to avoid peppermint oil, and that's because that increased alertness is actually going to disrupt or get in the way of sleep to some small degree. I do think it's interesting as a perfumer just to note that in some cases the raw materials you're using, so in this case like the peppermint oil, can actually exert a physiological effect on your body. I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that aromatherapy is something which really tries to deal with this subject. I'm not sure how solid and how scientifically sound some of the advice given by aromatherapy is, but I'm sure that in some cases they've got it right with some things. This whole thing with the peppermint oil actually reminded me of something else as well, and this was a book I read a couple of years ago called The Wolf of Wall Street, though it's also a film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, so some of you may be familiar with it from that. Anyway, this book is basically written by this guy called Jordan Belfort, goes by the name Wolf of Wall Street, who basically was a stock trader who made a lot of money back in the day. The way that he became super rich was effectively closing sales on these stock deals. Anyway, one of the strategies that he said in the book that he used was something he called anchoring. This was basically every time he made a big sale, immediately after he'd finished the phone call or the meeting, what he would do is he would take this kind of nasal spray, this essential oil nasal spray, and this contained lots of invigorating essential oils, things like peppermint. And what he would do is he'd spray that up his nose. And every time that he made a big sale like that, he would keep doing the same thing. So he would basically be doing what we talked about earlier, which was making one of these learned olfactory responses. So because olfaction is so closely tied to memory, what he was learning is to associate that mindset of success and that mindset that he'd been in to make that big sale. He'd associated that with this smell of these invigorating essential oils that he had with him. Anyway, eventually it got to the point where he could spray this thing up his nose before making a sale. And because of that learned olfactory response, it would put him back into that mindset of success, that mindset that he'd used last time to get the sale. And because he could get back into that mindset through the olfactory memory, he actually managed to increase the rate of sales he made, or according to him, it worked quite well. That last point wasn't covered by the podcast, though I will leave a link to the book that I read that in originally. I do really like the podcast though, the whole Huberman Lab podcast, not just this episode, so it's definitely something I would recommend you would check out if you're interested in neuroscience and the way that you can kind of apply these principles of neuroscience to your everyday life. I'll leave a link in the description, so definitely go check it out. Apart from that, that's all from me for today, so I hope you found something interesting. I hope something in there can help you with your perfumery. Please do consider subscribing, liking the video, leaving a comment and that kind of thing, as it really does help out with the channel. And apart from that, I'll see you soon with another video next time.